On a warm California afternoon in June 1979, 16-year-old Lucinda Cindy Schaefer was walking home from a church youth group meeting. She was a good student, the kind of teenager who rarely got into trouble, and she looked forward to the upcoming summer vacation. But as she walked along the Pacific Coast Highway that day, she had no idea two men were watching her. Men whose names would soon become synonymous with terror: Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris are now known as the Toolbox Killers, one of the most sadistic criminal duos in American history. Their crimes would horrify the nation, not just because of their brutality, but because of the careful, calculated way the pair turned murder into a project. One that played out over 5 young lives. This is the story of who they were, what they did, and how justice eventually caught up with them. Lawrence Sigmund Bittaker was born in 1940 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He never knew his birth parents and spent much of his early childhood in foster care. His adoptive parents tried to raise him well, but Lawrence struggled socially and academically despite his high intelligence. By the age of 12, he was already shoplifting, running away from home, and spending time in juvenile halls. In his late teens, he dropped out of high school and began a cycle of arrests: car theft, burglary, assault, that would put him behind bars for much of his early life. Roy Lewis Norris was 8 years younger, born in Colorado in 1948. His childhood was filled with instability. He bounced between foster homes where he claimed he was often neglected and abused. By his teenage years, he had developed disturbing sexual fantasies, many of which involved control, domination, and violence toward women. Norris joined the Navy, served briefly in Vietnam, but was later discharged for psychological issues. After leaving the military, he began committing sexual assaults, and by his mid-20s, he was in prison for multiple attacks. It was inside California's San Luis Obispo men's colony that Bittaker and Norris met in 1977. At first, they were just 2 inmates among thousands, but they soon bonded. They spent hours talking in the prison yard, sharing fantasies about abducting and torturing women. What might have been just talk for others became a blueprint for murder for them. The 2 men promised each other that when they were released, they would put their fantasies into action together. Bittaker was released in late 1978. He quickly found work as a machinist, earning a good wage and blending into society. Norris was released a few months later, in early 1979. The 2 reunited, just as they had planned, and began preparing. They bought a silver 1977 GMC cargo van, no windows, just a single sliding door, and customized it by removing the rear seats and adding a bed and storage for tools. To an outsider, it looked like a work van, the kind you might see parked outside a construction site. But to Bittaker and Norris, it was their hunting ground. They called it Murder Mack. For weeks, the pair drove the highways of Southern California, practicing. They would pick up female hitchhikers, talk to them, then let them go unharmed. This was their rehearsal. They were testing what worked, what kind of approach got girls into the van, how to keep them calm, how to avoid drawing attention. They were preparing for the real thing. Their first victim was Cindy Schaefer. On June 24, 1979, they spotted her walking home in Redondo Beach. When they offered her a ride, she refused and kept walking. This did not deter them. They drove ahead, parked, and waited. When Cindy passed the van, Norris grabbed her and forced her inside. She fought back, but she was overpowered and gagged. As Bittaker drove into the San Gabriel Mountains, Norris tied Cindy's wrists and ankles. For the next several hours, they kept her captive, taking turns assaulting her while parked in a secluded area. When they were finished, the 2 men faced a decision. Norris later claimed Cindy begged for her life, but Bittaker, who was cold and methodical, saw her as evidence, a witness who could put them behind bars. He took a coat hanger, twisted it into a ligature, and strangled her. When she was dead, they wrapped her body in a plastic shower curtain and threw her down a canyon. Her remains were never recovered. Only weeks later, they struck again. Their second victim was Andrea Hall, a 19-year-old who had been hitchhiking along the Pacific Coast Highway on July 8, 1979. Like Cindy, Andrea was forced into the van. This time, Bittaker drove deeper into the mountains, where they held Andrea for hours, repeatedly assaulting her. Bittaker reportedly took Polaroid photos of her terror, wanting to document the crime. Eventually, Andrea was killed with an ice pick driven into her ear. Her body was discarded in the mountains. Each time they killed, Bittaker and Norris became bolder. By September, they had abducted Jacqueline Gilliam and Jacqueline Lamp, both teenagers. This time, they held the girls for nearly 2 full days, assaulting them repeatedly. They recorded portions of the torture on an audio cassette, a tape so disturbing that to this day, only law enforcement and select jurors have heard its full contents. When they finally killed the girls, they strangled one and stabbed the other. Their bodies were thrown off a cliff. Their 5th and final known victim was Shirley Ledford, a 16-year-old who had been at a Halloween party on October 31st, 1979. Shirley accepted a ride from Bittaker and Norris because she recognized Bittaker from the restaurant where she sometimes worked. What happened next was one of the most sadistic murders in American history. For hours, the men tortured Shirley, recording everything on tape. They used pliers and hammers, mocked her screams, and seemed to revel in her pain. Finally, they strangled her with a coat hanger and dumped her body on a suburban lawn, where it was discovered the next morning. By now, fear had gripped Los Angeles County. Multiple teenage girls had vanished, and the cases seemed connected. The break came when Norris confided in a friend about the murders, describing details only the killers would know. The friend went to the police, and detectives quickly zeroed in on Bittaker and Norris. When police searched Bittaker's van, they found the tools, the hammers, pliers, and ice picks, along with hundreds of photographs of young women. They also discovered the chilling audio tape of Shirley Ledford's torture. Detectives said the tape was so disturbing that hardened veterans of the force left the room in tears. Norris, facing the death penalty, agreed to cooperate. He confessed to the murders in graphic detail, leading police to evidence and testifying against Bittaker. His testimony was crucial in securing Bittaker's conviction. In 1981, Lawrence Bittaker was sentenced to death. He spent decades on death row at San Quentin State Prison, filing appeals and insisting that the audio tape was merely a joke. In 2019, at the age of 79, Bittaker died of natural causes while still awaiting execution. Roy Norris, who had taken a plea deal, was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years. He was never released. He died in prison in 2020. The case of the Toolbox Killers remains one of the most horrifying in California history. The audio tape of Shirley Ledford's torture is still used in FBI training programs to desensitize agents to the sounds of human suffering. It is a case that forces us to confront the darkest possibilities of human behavior and to remember the names of the young women whose lives were stolen. When Shirley Ledford's body was discovered on the quiet suburban lawn in Sunland, California, the community was horrified. It was early morning, November 1st, 1979, and trick-or-treat candy wrappers still littered the sidewalks from the night before. Shirley's injuries were so severe that the first responders at the scene had to steady themselves before documenting the crime. Her face was bruised and swollen, and marks across her neck revealed she had been strangled with something thin and metallic. There were ligature marks on her wrists and ankles, evidence she had been bound. And then there were the other injuries, the ones too disturbing to mention in detail on the nightly news but clear enough to investigators. Whoever had killed Shirley had enjoyed causing pain. Detectives immediately suspected that this was not the work of a first-time killer. The level of sadism pointed to someone who had either killed before or had been planning this for a long time. What the police did not yet realize was that Shirley was not the first victim. She was the 5th. Over the next several days, investigators combed through missing person reports, looking for patterns. There had been a spike in teenage girls disappearing in Los Angeles and Orange County since early summer. Some had been hitchhiking, others simply walking home. Most of their bodies were never recovered. Investigators began to wonder whether they were dealing with a serial offender, or perhaps more than one. The case broke open when Roy Norris, one of the killers, did something that would ultimately seal his fate. He talked. Not long after Shirley's murder, Norris confided in an acquaintance named Joseph Jackson. Norris described in horrifying detail what he and Lawrence Bittaker had done, the abductions, the torture, and the murders, He even mentioned the audio tape, boasting about how they had recorded one of their victims as she screamed for her life. Jackson was horrified. At first, he didn't know if he believed Norris. But when Norris described the location where one of the bodies had been dumped, a detail never released to the public, Jackson realized he was telling the truth. Jackson immediately went to the Los Angeles Police Department. Detectives from the LAPD and Hermosa Beach PD began surveilling both Norris and Bittaker. It didn't take long for them to see behavior that raised red flags. Bittaker was stopped and arrested for marijuana possession, which gave investigators an excuse to hold him temporarily while they gathered evidence. When they searched Bittaker's van, they discovered what they later described as a mobile chamber of horrors. Inside, police found a sledgehammer, pliers, an ice pick, 2 hammers, and a tape recorder. They also found hundreds of photographs of young women and girls, some of whom were nude, others who appeared terrified. The most chilling piece of evidence, however, was the audio tape. It contained a recording of Shirley Ledford's final moments. Detectives who listened to it said it was one of the most disturbing things they had ever heard. The tape captured not only Shirley's screams but the voices of Bittaker and Norris as they mocked her pain. One veteran officer later testified that he had nightmares for months after hearing it. With this evidence in hand, police brought Norris in for questioning. Faced with the possibility of the death penalty, Norris quickly broke. He confessed to all 5 murders in graphic detail, providing names, dates, and locations. He even led police to some of the disposal sites in the San Gabriel Mountains, though most of the victims' remains were never recovered. Norris's confession painted a picture of a partnership that was as chilling as it was methodical. According to Norris, Bittaker was the dominant partner, the planner and instigator, while Norris considered himself more of a reluctant participant. But his description of the events made clear that he was no bystander. He admitted to physically restraining victims, sexually assaulting them, and helping dispose of their bodies. Detectives now had enough evidence to charge both men with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, rape, and torture. The district attorney faced a decision. Should they try both men together, or offer Norris a plea deal in exchange for testimony against Bittaker? Given the brutality of the crimes and the importance of ensuring a conviction, prosecutors struck a deal with Norris. He would plead guilty to 4 counts of murder, testify against Bittaker, and in exchange, he would receive life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years instead of the death penalty. This decision was controversial, but prosecutors believed it was the only way to guarantee Bittaker would receive the maximum sentence. Norris accepted the deal and became the state's star witness. The trial of Lawrence Bittaker began in January 1981 and lasted 3 weeks. In the courtroom, prosecutors laid out their case methodically, walking the jury through each of the 5 murders. They presented photographs from the van, physical evidence, and most damning of all, they played a portion of the audio tape. Journalists who attended the trial said the tape left the courtroom in stunned silence. Some jurors openly wept. Even the court reporter reportedly stopped typing at one point because she was crying. The tape was not played in its entirety, only enough to establish the sadistic nature of the crime, but that was more than enough. Witness after witness testified about Bittaker's cold demeanor. One detective described how, when shown the Polaroids of his victims during questioning, Bittaker remained emotionless, as though he were looking at strangers. The defense tried to argue that Norris was the true mastermind and that Bittaker had merely gone along with the crimes. But Norris's detailed testimony, combined with the evidence from the van, painted a very different picture. After deliberating for just 3 days, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts. Lawrence Bittaker was sentenced to death. At the sentencing, family members of the victims were given the chance to speak. One relative of Shirley Ledford told Bittaker, "You destroyed so many lives, not just Shirley's, but all of ours." Bittaker sat quietly, showing no reaction. When asked if he had anything to say, Bittaker simply shook his head. Bittaker was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he spent the next 38 years on death row. He continued to file appeals, claiming his trial had been unfair, but every appeal was denied. In 2019, at the age of 79, Lawrence Bittaker died of natural causes while still awaiting execution. He never expressed remorse. Roy Norris, for his part, remained in prison until his death in 2020. In interviews from behind bars, Norris occasionally expressed regret, saying he wished he had never met Bittaker. But to the families of the victims, those words meant little. The legacy of the Toolbox Killers lives on as a grim warning. The case is often used in FBI training programs to teach agents about criminal profiling and the psychology of sadistic killers. The audio tape of Shirley Ledford's torture is still played for new recruits, not as sensationalism, but as preparation for the kind of evil they may one day encounter. For the families of Cindy Schaefer, Andrea Hall, Jackie Gilliam, Jackie Lamp, and Shirley Ledford, there is no true closure. Their daughters' lives were stolen, their futures erased. But thanks to one friend's courage to speak up and the relentless work of detectives and prosecutors, the men responsible were taken off the streets forever. By the time the trial ended and Lawrence Bittaker was sentenced to death, the story of the Toolbox Killers had gripped the nation. The courtroom proceedings had been front-page news across California, and coverage of the case ran nightly on television. But behind the headlines were 5 families who had been devastated, and communities that were still struggling to process how such evil could have existed so close to home. To truly understand the impact of these crimes, we have to step back and look at who these girls were and what was taken from them. Cindy Schaefer was the first. Cindy was just 16 years old, a high school junior who loved music and church. Her friends described her as sweet and dependable, the kind of girl who would stay after youth group to help clean up. She had dreams of becoming a teacher one day. Her father described her as the light of their family, a girl who never caused trouble and rarely even missed curfew. When Cindy didn't come home on June 24, 1979, her parents immediately knew something was wrong. They called the police that night, but at first, officers thought she might have run away. It was only after days passed with no word that investigators began to suspect foul play. For Cindy's parents, the wait for answers was agonizing. And because her body was never found, they never got to lay her to rest. Andrea Hall was next. 19 years old and fiercely independent, Andrea was a free spirit who loved to travel. She had been hitchhiking near the Pacific Coast Highway when she encountered Bittaker and Norris. Hitchhiking was common at the time, and many young people saw it as an adventure, a way to meet people and get where they needed to go without spending money. Andrea was cautious, but she also believed most people were good. Her disappearance devastated her family, who spent weeks posting flyers and pleading for information. Her father later said that for years, he left the porch light on every night, hoping she might come home. Jackie Gilliam and Jackie Lamp were best friends. They were just 15 and 13 years old. The two girls had gone to the beach together on September 3, 1979. Planning to spend Labor Day weekend enjoying the last days of summer. When they didn't return home, their parents called police, but because both girls had run away once before, authorities were initially slow to act. For weeks, their families clung to the hope that the girls had simply taken off again and would eventually call. The truth was much darker. Bittaker and Norris had kept the girls alive for nearly 2 days, during which time they were subjected to unimaginable abuse. It was Norris who later revealed this to police during his confession, a revelation that broke even seasoned detectives. And then there was Shirley Ledford, the final victim. Shirley was a popular high school student who loved working part-time at a local restaurant. She was known for her kindness and quick smile. On Halloween night, she attended a party with friends and stayed until late. When she couldn't find a ride home, she decided to hitchhike, something she had done before without trouble. Witnesses later reported seeing her laughing and talking with Bittaker before she got into the van. They never saw her alive again. For the families, each revelation in court was like ripping open a wound that had barely started to heal. They sat through testimony about how their daughters were bound, tortured, and killed, details so graphic that at times they had to leave the courtroom. But they stayed, determined to see justice served. Outside the courtroom, the public was in shock. Newspapers called Bittaker and Norris the most sadistic killers in California history. Parents who had once allowed their kids to walk to school or hitchhike now kept them close. Police received a flood of calls from worried citizens reporting suspicious vans, and sales of pepper spray and self-defense classes skyrocketed. Even seasoned investigators were shaken. Some later admitted that the case haunted them for years. The audio tape was played only for those who absolutely had to hear it, and copies were kept under strict security. One detective said, "You can't unhear something like that. It stays with you." The case also sparked debate about California's criminal justice system. Many questioned how two men with such violent histories were released from prison and able to commit these crimes. At the time, California's parole system was under pressure to reduce prison overcrowding, which meant many offenders were released early. After the Toolbox Killers case, there was a public outcry for tougher sentencing laws, particularly for violent sexual offenders. Some of these calls would eventually contribute to California's three strikes law in the 1990s, which mandated longer sentences for repeat offenders. But beyond the politics and media attention, there were quiet moments of grief. Candlelight vigils were held for the victims, where neighbors and strangers alike came to mourn. Local churches opened their doors for prayer services. For many, the case was a reminder that evil could strike anywhere, even in sunny, suburban California. When Bittaker was sent to San Quentin, there was a sense of relief but not celebration. The families of the victims knew that no punishment could ever undo what had been done. Some found comfort in the death sentence, believing it was the only just outcome. Others admitted they did not care what happened to Bittaker, as long as he could never hurt anyone again. Roy Norris, who had avoided the death penalty by cooperating, became a controversial figure. Some saw his testimony as necessary to bring Bittaker to justice, while others felt he had escaped the punishment he deserved. In prison interviews, Norris sometimes expressed remorse, but he also claimed that Bittaker had been the driving force behind the killings. This did little to sway public opinion. For most people, both men were equally responsible. The case of the Toolbox Killers left a lasting scar on California. It changed the way law enforcement handled missing persons cases, particularly those involving teenagers. Before this case, police often assumed that teens who went missing were runaways, and investigations could be delayed for days or even weeks. Afterward, departments across the state began taking abduction reports more seriously, launching immediate searches when teens disappeared under suspicious circumstances. It also left a legacy in the field of criminal profiling. FBI profilers studied the case closely, using it to better understand the psychology of sadistic killers who work in pairs. Bittaker and Norris were a rare example of a killer duo who operated with such precision and brutality. Their case has been cited in textbooks and used in law enforcement training to this day. And yet, despite all the analysis, one haunting question remains. Why? Why did these two men, with the chance to rebuild their lives after prison, choose to use their freedom to destroy others? Investigators who spent years on the case have suggested different theories. Some believe Bittaker was a psychopath, incapable of empathy, who saw murder as a way to exert control. Norris, they believe, was a deeply damaged man who found in Bittaker a partner who encouraged his darkest impulses. Together, they became something far more dangerous than either might have been alone. For viewers today, the story of the Toolbox Killers is almost unbelievable in its cruelty. But it is also a story about justice, about the detectives who refused to give up, and about the courage of an ordinary man, Joseph Jackson, who risked his own safety to tell police what he knew. Without him, Bittaker and Norris might never have been caught. When the trial of Lawrence Bittaker opened in early 1981, the courtroom was packed. Reporters from every major newspaper in California sat shoulder to shoulder with ordinary citizens who had come just to see the man accused of some of the most sadistic murders in state history. The families of the victims were there too, sitting in the front rows, bracing themselves for what they were about to hear. The prosecution's strategy was clear, to show that Bittaker was not just a participant, but the mastermind, the calculating force behind every abduction and every killing. To do that, they relied heavily on the testimony of Roy Norris. When Norris took the stand, the courtroom was silent. He spoke in a flat, emotionless voice, recounting how he and Bittaker would drive the highways looking for victims, how they selected girls who looked young and vulnerable, and how they lured them into the van. He described the assaults in chilling detail, explaining how Bittaker insisted on taking Polaroids and sometimes even audio recordings to relive the crimes later. Perhaps most disturbing was Norris's account of Shirley Ledford's final hours. He told the jury how Shirley pleaded for her life, how she screamed until she was hoarse, and how Bittaker seemed to take pleasure in prolonging her suffering. Some jurors wiped away tears as Norris spoke. Others avoided looking at him, staring instead at the floor. Then came the moment many had dreaded, the playing of the audio tape. Prosecutors chose to play only a portion, just enough to establish the sadistic nature of the crime, but it was enough to send a shiver through everyone in the courtroom. On the tape, Shirley's terrified voice could be heard begging for mercy. Bittaker's voice was calm, almost casual, as he taunted her. When the tape stopped, there was complete silence. One juror later said that the sound of the tape would haunt them for the rest of their life. The prosecutor looked each juror in the eye and said, "This is the voice of a girl in her last moments of life. This is the voice of evil laughing at her pain. And the man responsible is sitting right there." The defense tried to shift blame onto Norris, painting him as the real killer and Bittaker as a man who had merely gone along. But the evidence told a different story. The Polaroids found in the van, the testimony of witnesses who had seen Bittaker cruising the highways, and the physical evidence from the crime scenes all pointed to him as the ringleader. After 3 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for just 3 days before returning with their verdict. Guilty on 26 of 29 counts, including 5 counts of first-degree murder. When the verdict was read, Bittaker showed no emotion. The families of the victims wept quietly. Some embraced each other. Others simply stared at Bittaker, as if trying to understand how one human being could inflict so much pain. During the sentencing phase, family members were given the chance to speak. One by one, they stood and faced the man who had taken their daughters. A father said, "You did not just kill my daughter. You killed our family's joy. You killed birthdays and Christmas mornings. You killed the future we dreamed of for her." The judge sentenced Lawrence Bittaker to death. He was transported to San Quentin State Prison and placed on death row, where he would spend the next 38 years. Life on death row was uneventful for Bittaker. He rarely spoke to other inmates and spent most of his time reading and writing legal appeals. He became known among prison staff as polite, even soft-spoken, a fact that many found unsettling given the crimes he had committed. He filed appeal after appeal, claiming that the trial had been unfair, but each was denied. In interviews from death row, Bittaker continued to insist that the audio tape was a prank and that he had been unfairly portrayed as a sadistic killer. Few believed him. His lack of remorse only deepened the pain of the victims' families, who waited year after year for his execution. Roy Norris, meanwhile, served his life sentence at a different California prison. He was eligible for parole after 30 years, but the public outcry each time he came up for a hearing was so strong that he was never released. Norris died of natural causes in 2020. For the families, there was no real sense of victory. Justice had been served, yes, but the wounds remained. Some spoke about their grief years later, saying that not a day went by that they didn't think about their daughters. Others found ways to honor their memory, establishing scholarships or volunteering for organizations that help victims of violent crime. The case of the Toolbox Killers left a mark on California law enforcement. It led to more coordinated efforts to track serial offenders, faster response times to missing persons reports, and the use of criminal profiling to identify potential suspects earlier. The FBI studied the case as a textbook example of a sadistic killer pair, and the lessons learned have been used to catch other predators in the decades since. But perhaps the most enduring impact is the reminder of the importance of speaking up. If Joseph Jackson had stayed silent, if detectives had dismissed the missing girls as runaways, Bittaker and Norris might never have been caught. Their arrest and conviction show how crucial it is for ordinary people to act when something feels wrong. Today, more than 4 decades later, the story of the Toolbox Killers still has the power to shock and horrify. It is a case that forces us to confront the darkest corners of human nature, the capacity for cruelty, the thrill of control, and the tragedy of innocent lives cut short. It is also a case about resilience, about families who, even in their grief, refused to let their daughters be forgotten, about detectives who worked tirelessly to bring killers to justice, about a community that came together to say, "This will not happen again." As the sun sets over the San Gabriel Mountains, the place where so many of these crimes took place, the silence feels heavy. It is a silence that carries the memory of Cindy Schaefer, Andrea Hall, Jackie Gilliam, Jackie Lamp, and Shirley Ledford, 5 young women whose lives were stolen but whose names still matter. Their story is a warning, a tragedy, and a call to action all at once. A call to watch over each other, to take danger seriously, and to never look away when evil shows its face. Because as the case of the Toolbox Killers taught California, sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who look like ordinary men driving an ordinary van.